We're going to look at the Mishnah for a second on Daf Tes Amud Beis, and just one part of the Mishnah, and that is Sukkah al Gabi Sukkah. So he's got one Sukkah on top of the other, and the Mishnah establishes that Helyona Kshera, the top Sukkah is okay, V'tachtona Psula. So we're going to go straight to the Gemara, and it's Taner Rabbanon, which is approximately, I would say, 10 lines up from the bottom of Tes Amud Beis. Let me know if you have it.
Yeah, I have it.
Taner Rabbanon, we learned it in Brisa. Now we're going to have the drasha that gives us the source for this halacha that Sukkah Tachas Sukkah is Psula. Basukos Teshru Shivas Yomim. And the word Sukkos here is understood to be in the singular. That's pretty odd. Below Besukkah Tachas HaSukkah, because you have one sukkah on top of the other, that's not one sukkah, but rather two sukkahs. And also below Besukkah Tachas HaElon, because once again, the Elon gives you schach. You have a sukkah that's under the Elon. So again, it's like two sukkahs. Or below Besukkah Shvitov Habayis, the roof of the house, gives you the protection on top. And now you have the schach on the sukkah inside the house. It's again a case of more than one sukkah. So the Gemara immediately asks, Adarab, Basukos. The pasuk says in plural. It doesn't say sukkahs in singular. Tarte mashma. Basukos teishru means, on the contrary, sit in two sukkahs. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and this is what's called ksiv. Basukos ksiv. We have a Masorah that the word sukkos is written without a vav. And if you read it without a vav, it's written in a lashon yachid. It doesn't say bisukos in the plural, but kilu bisukas in one sukkah. And that tells you that you have to sit in one sukkah, and this comes to exclude a case of two sukkahs. Amar Rav Yirmiyah, ba'amim sheshtehen ksheros, pamim sheshtehen psulas, pamim shatachtona ksher v'elyona psula, pamim shatachtona psula v'elyona ksher. You could have all four scenarios. It's possible in the case of Sukkah Tachas HaSukkah that both sukkahs will be ksheros, both will be psulos. The bottom sukkah will be ksher, the top will be psula, which sounds a little bit odd. And the top one will be kshera, that makes sense, but the bottom one will be psula. And now Rabbi Yomi is going to work out four scenarios to fit these four halachos. Amim sheshtein ksheros. Hechi dami. What would be a case where both the Sukkah Elyona and the Tachtona ksheros? Higon, the Tachtona chamasa meruba mitzilasa, V'elyona tzilasa meruba michamsa. Now let's go slowly. I understand very well the sefer. Elyona, the top sukkah is kshera because there's more tzel than schach. But yet he says that the bottom sukkah has more sunlight than tzel. So if that be the case, it doesn't have schach kosher. How could the tachtona be kshera? And the Gemara adds another stipulation, another condition to Rabbi Yirmiyah's opening statement, and that is Elyona b'toch esrim. It has to be that the schach on the Elyona is within 20 amos, because the Mishnah opens up Masechet Sukkah. We discussed this last week, that if the schach is above esrim amma, the sukkah is psula. Okay, so we have schach that's less than 20 amma high, and it's tzela, meruba, silsa, merubsa, michamsa. As far as the Elyon is concerned, I understand it's kosher. Why is the tachtona kshera? And the answer is that Rabbi Yirmiyah operates with the following premise: that schach, which is chamsa, merubsa, mitzelsa, is not schach at all. It's kiman de lesigam. It's batal and mavutal, doesn't exist. And now the Elyona is the schach for the tachtona. The tachtona can now use the schach on the Elyona because it's not sukkah tachas sukkah. The bottom sukkah doesn't have any schach because it's chamsa merubsa mitzelsa. Chamsa merubsa mitzelsa is not schach, and therefore the lowest sukkah is considered directly under the schach of the Elyona, which is below esrim amal, and therefore either way, everything is kosher. What would be the case where both the Elyona and the tachtona are psula? And I could guess this without even reading the Gemara. Both of them would have schach that's chamsa merubsa mitzelsa. Neither schach is kosher. And the Gemara answers, kigon the travayu tzilsa meruba mechamsa. Now this is a surprise. We thought that let's anticipate why both of them are psulas because neither of them have schach kosher, but that's partial. The Gemara wants to see in Rabbi Yirmiyah a bigger chiddush. That on the contrary, both sukkahs have tzilsa merubsa mechamsa. However, the problem is that the Elyona is above 20 am. So although there's enough schach, but it's possible because it's too high up. Fine. So why is the tachtona psula? And that's going to be the halacha of schach tachas haschach. Now you might ask me, well, what do you mean schach tachas haschach? The schach of the sukkah Elyona is not kshera. It's above 20 amos. But the answer is that's not a psul in the schach itself. The schach per se, in and of itself, if you lower it, would be kshera. And now it's covering over the schach of the tachtona. And therefore the tachtona is possible because the Torah says besukos without a vav. And it means that tachtona is a sukkah tachas sukkah. Or omim shahatachtona kshera v'elyona psula. That's a little bit odd. You know, why would the tachtona be kshera and the elyona is psula? So here we start daf yud. Hechi domi, what's the case? Kigon shatachtona tzilsa merubsa michamsa. Fine. We understand very well that the bottom sukkah, which he calls the tachtona, is shera because it has the exact kosher schach of tzilsa merubsa michamsa. Wait a minute. The bottom sukkah is schach tachas haschach. So now let's talk about the top sukkah. Elyona chamsa merubsa mitzelsa. The kaimi travayu b'toch esrei. The schach of the Elyon is not schach at all. It's not a case of lamala bichav, where the schach per se is kosher, because it's too high up, but there's not enough schach. If you thin out the schach to such an extent that it's chamsa merubsa michamsa, it's nothing. So the tachtona is not considered schach tachas schach because the Elyona has no schach. And why doesn't the Elyona have schach? Because it's chamsa merubsa mitzelsa. Now here the Gemara adds a condition that both sukkahs are b'toch esrim. Now that implies that if the top sukkah was lamala me'esrim, then there would be a problem. And offhand, I don't understand exactly what the problem would be, because if it's chamsa merubsa mitzelsa, then we said it's not schach at all. So why would that cause a psul to the tachtona? And I think what the Gemara is now saying, by implication, meaning b'toch esrim implies that the sukkah Elyona could not be lamala me'esrim, that if the sukkah Elyona was lamayla me'esrim, then we have something called siruch schach pasul l'schach kosher. What does that mean? That means that although the Elyona is not considered schach, but we don't say it's command lesadom, as if it doesn't exist. And therefore, in this case, since the Succah Elyon is possible because it's Lamayla B'Yesrim, therefore it passes the Sukkah Tachtona based on the Tzir of Succah. So what we're going to do is we're going to integrate the Succah of the Elyon, which is possible because it's Lamayla B'Yesrim, together with the Succah of the Tachton, and through that Tzir of Succah, we're going to passel the Tachton. So the only way that the Sukkah Tachtona could be Shera, and it has the right Succah, is if the Elyona is within Esrim Amo. So it's not Succah possible, but rather it's not Succah at all. Had it been Lamala Esrim, then it would take on the status of Succah, but it would be Succah possible, and then we'd be Mitzaref and integrate the Succah possible with the Elyon together with the Succah of the Tachton. Finally, the last case of Yirmiyah is Pa'amin Shal Yona Kshera V'Tachtona Psula. That seems simple enough. Hechi Domi Kigon the Travayu Silsa Merubsa Micham. So they both have Succah kosher. And Kaimo Elyona B'Toch Esrim. So certainly Elyona is kosher. And now the bottom sukkah is Succah Tachas Succah or Sukkah Tachas Sukkah. Or says Pshita, we have a principle called Sukkah, which is Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa. That's not considered Succah. That was already at the beginning of the Masechet on Daf Beis. And therefore, if you have one Sukkah that's Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa, then you can't passel another Sukkah, which is underneath it, because it's not Succah at all. So what did Rav Yirmiyah come to teach me? What's the Chiddush of Rav Yirmiyah? So the Gemara answers, you know what? 3 out of 4 of Rav Yirmiyah's points are Pshita. I don't need Rav Yirmiyah. I need Rav Yirmiyah for one particular point, and not because of the Doraisa halacha, but because of a chashash that would cross our minds that maybe we should have a Gzeira D'Rabbanan and passel it B'Rabbanan. How so? Tachtona Kshera, V'Elyona Psula, Itzrichle. Everything that Rabbi Yomi presented was to tell me this one chiddush about the case of Tachtona Kshera, Elyona Psula. But what's the case? The bottom sukkah has Tzelsa Merubsa Michamsa, and that's why it's Kshera. The Elyona is Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa. And they're both within 20 Amma of the Karka. Ma'oditema, I would have thought that in such a case, Nigzar, we should institute a Gzeira. And we should passel the Sukkah Tachtona, even though, again, the Sukkah Tachtona is neither Chamsa Merubsa Tzelsa Merubsa Michamsa. It has the right exact volume of Succah. And it's not Succah Tachsa Succah, because the Elyona is Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa, which doesn't even register on the Rector scale. It's not Succah at all, and it's within Esrim Amos, there's no Psul. But what's the room for Gzeira? Dilma Mitztaref Succah Apostle Bahari Succah Kosher. Perhaps the spectator will come to the conclusion that since the Elyona is Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa, he might think that in such a case, the Succah doesn't register at all, and he's going to be machshir even in the case where the Succah Elyona is above Esrim Amma. In fact, we've racked our brains to try to figure out why the Succah of the top sukkah, if it was Chamsa Merubsa Mitzelsa above Esrim Amma, why would that pass the Succah? And we introduced the new principle of Succah, of Tzir of Succah possible with Succah kosher. We don't know of such a principle. She's Tarif Succah possible, Bahari Succah kosher. And therefore, we're going to come to the conclusion that there's no way that you should integrate Succah possible into Succah kosher. You didn't do so in the case where the Elyona was Tachas within Esrim Amma. Why should you do so if the Elyona is above Esrim Amma? Therefore, we should passel the sukkah midrabanan mitam gzeira if the Elyona, which is Chamsa Musa Tzelso, is within Esrim Am. And we should apply the institute this Gzeira because maybe he'll come to be Machshir even in a case where the Elyona is above Esrim Am. But Mashmalan, that's the single Chiddush of Rabbi Yirmiyah, that we don't institute such a Gzeira. And if the Sukkah Elyona is not above Esrim Am, but it's below Esrim Am, and it's Chamsa Musa Mitzelsa, it's Keman Delesidami, there's no Schach, the Taftona is Tzelsa Musa V'Chamsa, it's Kshera, and there's no din here of Schach, Tachas HaSchach. Now, in this footnote, here in the Masechet, he goes through the other three cases of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he shows why each one is Pshita, and therefore we can only justify the Chiddush of Rabbi Yirmiyah in that case where he's Machshir the Taftona, and he passes the Elyon. So I'm going to very quickly go through the three scenarios of Rabbi Yirmiyah which are Pshita. Number one, the case of Shteim Ksheros. The Tachtona is Chamsa Merubsa B'Tzelsa. The Elyona is Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa. But it's all within Esrim Amma. Then it's Pshita that the Elyona is Kshera, there's no Havmina otherwise, and therefore the Tachtona is now considered Kshera because its Schach is Chamsa Merubsa B'Tzelsa, and that's not Schach at all, so there are no two Schachs over here, but rather we could be Mati the Tachtona based on the Schach of the Elyona. Shtein Psulos, where there was Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa on both of the Sukkahs, the Elyona and the Tachtona, but the Elyona is above Esrim Amma, so that for sure is Psula. And even the Tachtona is Psula. 1 second, did I get this right? They're both, I'm sorry, they're both Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa. And the Elyona is above Esrim Amma. Okay, fine. So far, so good. Now, the Elyona is Psula because it's above Esrim Amma. Why is the Tachtona Psula? And the answer is because since the Elyona is Kshera, and this is a case where the Elyona is B'toch Esrim Amma and Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa. The Mele, the Tachtona is Schach Tachas Schach, which is explicit in the Mishnah. And the third case is Tachtona Kshera, Elyona Psula. And what is the scenario? The Tachtona is Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa, which is fine. So the Tachtona is certainly Kshera. The Elyona is Chamsa Merubsa, which certainly is possible. But maybe we should passel the bottom sukkah. We did Schach Tachas Schach. But the answer is since they're both Toch Esrim Amma, the Tachtona is Kshera, it's Tzelsa Merubsa B'Chamsa. So the Elyona, which is Chamsa Meruba, is considered as if it doesn't have any schach at all because it's Toch Esrim Amma, and therefore it doesn't passel the Tachtona bidin schach tachas haschach. Now the Gemara asks, Kama yehei bein sukkah l'sukkah utehei Tachtona psula. This psula of our Mishnah of schach tachas haschach must be that there are two schachs, but if the schach on top is very close to the schach on the bottom, then we should be able to integrate the two as if it's one schach, and there's no psul of sukkah tachas sukkah. Rav Huna tefa. Rav Huna says that if the distance, the airspace between the top stop and the one below it is a tefach, then we have, with regard to the bottom one, a psul of schach tachas. Where does Rav Huna borrow this halacha tefach? From olos. Because in the case of an oel, which means that the oel is chotzeit b'fnei atuma. So if you have kalim or person on top of the oel, and the corpse is inside the oel, the person on top of the oel is not mitame, nor the kalim. Why? Because the gag, the roof of the oel, becomes a chatzitza. But that's because you have a tefach of airspace inside the oil. That gives it a shem oil. Now the good news is that anything above the gag of the oil is tar. But the bad news is that if you have an oil, because you have an airspace of a tefach, then anything inside the oil is tumah, meaning the tumah of the corpse spreads throughout the oil, kalim, and other. If, on the other hand, you don't have a halal tefach, then you don't have an oil. And in that case, the good news is that there's nothing to spread the tumah within that oil because it's not an oil. But the bad news is we have halacha called tumah ritzutza, which is olad l'rakia. So that if the oil is called a pancake, I hate to use that term, especially after what happened in Surfside. But I mean to say, if the oil is almost like flat, it's got no airspace, not even a tefach, then again, I can only say this in human terms, but that's not what it means in halakha, but it means the corpse, so to speak, is trapped and it has to spread its tumah all the way up to Shamayim. So Amar Rav Huna tefach, shekei matzinu be oil tumah tefach. That the status and the definition of an oil depends upon tefach. Isnan, as we learned in the third parak of Olos, tefach al tefach, barum tefach, maybe a satuma, meaning it's an oil. You have tefach in the height, you have tefach in the width. So that's called barum tefach in the height, and tefach al tefach is in the width. And now you have a bona fide oil, and all the kalim and the adam within that oil, because of the mess, become tum. Also, chotzitz b'fnei. So that's the kula. That if you have an oil, the oil is a chatzitza, and anything above the gag of the oil remains tov. Avol pochos mirum tefach. But if you don't have a height of a tefach inside the oil, it's not an oil. Lo maybe a satuma, which is good news. You don't spread the tumah throughout the oil. But the bad news is that becomes tumah ritzutza, and that's called the lo chotzitz. Tumah bokas ad l'rakia. The tumah is not a separation. I'm sorry, the top of the oil is not a separation because we don't have an oil. It's pachos mirum tefach, and therefore the tumah has nowhere to go. It can't spread throughout the oil because you don't have an oil. It goes all the way up to Shamayim, ad l'rakia. Now, Rav Huda makes the following analogy that just like in tumah, the halal inside the oil, in order to set up a shame oil, has to be a tefach. So too, with regard to sukkah, we need a separation between one sukkah, the top sukkah, and the second sukkah, the bottom sukkah, of at least a halal tefach. Then we could say that the bottom sukkah is a sukkah unto itself, and the top sukkah is a sukkah unto itself. The bottom sukkah is psula, midin sukkah tachas sukkah. And what sets up the sukkah on the bottom side as a separate entity is the fact that there's airspace of a tefach, which is the shear of an oil. So you have an amount of space, of airspace, that would constitute an oil separating the top schach from the bottom schach. Now, if the distance between the top schach and the bottom schach is less than a tefach, let's say it's 3 etzbos, then it's considered all as one schach, and it's not possible in schach taksas. So holds Rav Huda. Now we get to Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna Amri Arba 4 tvachim. If there's a distance, an airspace of 4 tvachim between the two schachs, then it becomes two separate entities, and it's possible. The bottom one is possible because of Sukkah tachas Sukkah. If on the other hand you have less than 4 tvachim in the airspace, then it's all considered one schach. It's not schach tachas schach. Where did we get this 4 tvachim from? So for this we have to learn a little bit of Masechet Shabbos, Rishuyos l'Shabbos, and a Rishus HaYachid has to have the minimum dimension of 4 tvachim. Less than 4 tvachim, it's not considered Rishus at all unto itself. It's batel to any other Rishus, unless it has a width of 4 tvachim. So a makom chashuv, to set up its own Rishus, has to have 4 tvachim. if we want to separate the schach on top from the schach on the bottom to apply the principle of schach as a psul, then we have to have at least an equivalent amount of airspace that would form a rishus, that would have that chashivas, and that's 4 tefachim. Shmuel Omar Asara, unless there's 10 tefachim between the schach tachton and schach elyon, there's no psul of sukkah tachas sukkah. Where does Shmuel derive this halach of 10 tefachim? My time with the Shmuel. And the Gemara answers, Kehechshera kach psula. Interesting, a new principle. It's like kibolo kach polta. Kehechshera, kehpsula kach hechshera. What does this mean? To separate the two sukkahs, you need a sukkah's worth of space in between them. And the minimum height, the smallest height of a sukkah is 10 tefachim. So just like with regard to a psul sukkah, you will passel a sukkah if it's less than 10 tefachim. So too, and the flip side is that you need at least 10 tefachim minimum in order to set up a sukkah. So too, on the side of a psul sukkah, so for hechsher sukkah, I need 10 tefachim. And for psul sukkah, I need up to 10 tefachim. Meaning a little bit below 10 tefachim, because then I need. No, I'm sorry, just to reverse. I'm sorry. I need 10 tefachim. Why? Because I have to have a sukkah's worth of separation between the schach tachton and the schach elyon. So I read to you the Hebrew. He writes, Hainu shir gova hasukkah elyona aposelas hasukkah b'tachteo ve'asor tefachim. So he's learning a different pshat than what I suggested. He's saying that the top sukkah, in order to passel the bottom sukkah, has to have the shear of gova sukkah. I'll read it one more time. He says, "Dahainu shir gova sukkah yona, aposelas es hasukkah tachtona hu basara tefachim. Ulam im ein gavoa asara tefachim ein aposel tachtela mishum sukkah tachas sukkah named domer meachar upsul sukkah tachas sukkah nidrash me'akasu basukos." At the absence of the vav, mashma shetzorach leishev tachas sukkah achas below tachas shtei sukkos. Lefichach dafka im yesh la sukkah elyonas shem sukkah kshera, which means it's got the height of 10 tefachim. Then nefshav adnor sheish kan shtei sukkos. Uposelas hiyas a sukkah tachtona. Ulam im eina sukkah elyona kshera, because it's got less than 10 tefachim height. Ein kan shtei sukkos. There are no two sukkos. The top one is not called the sukkah. Ve'ena poselas es ha tachtona. Now, Shmuel's principle, I have to clean off this screen. Anyway, Shmuel's principle is that the Elyona, in order to passel the Tachtonim, within Sukkah Tachsukkah, has to be Kshera in and of itself. So let's say, for example, one of the various conditions in a sukkah to be a sukkah kshera is what's called roy l'dira. Now, roy l'dira means not only that you could eat there and drink there, but also you could sleep there. That's one of the mitzvahs of Teshuvah Kein Tadur. So let's say, for example, you'll see the example in just a minute, you have a sukkah, and in order to sleep in the sukkah, you have to put what's called karim uksasams, pillows, mattresses. And let's say the karim uksusas are very shaky. They can't hold up, maybe they could hold up your body, but it's very, very iffy. You don't want to sleep on those kind of karim uksusas. So that becomes a sukkah she'eina ru'uya l'dira. Supposing now, in the light of Shmuel, who says that if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim high, it doesn't qualify as a sukkah, so that it cannot passel the sukkah below it. What happens in a case where the sukkah elyona is psula, not because it's lower than 10 tefachim, but because it is a what's called a sukkah she'eina ru'uya l'dira. So Tanan, the Gemara now is going to ask a kasha on Shmuel. Now, when we go back to the Mishnah that we started with on Tesam and Beis, we see that at the end of the Mishnah is the dissenting view of Rabbi Yehuda. We didn't read it when we started, but now we'll read it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im ein diurin belyona hatachtona kshera. That under certain circumstances, Rabbi Yehuda says, we do not apply the psul of sukkah tachas sukkah, and that's a case where there's no one living in the top sukkah. That's called ein diurin belyona. So the Gemara doesn't understand. If you take this literally, my ein diurim belyona ile b'diurim mamish. You want to know whether people are living in the sukkah elyona? What difference does that make? Otu diurim kagarmi, is the psul of sukkah taksa sukkah generated by the fact that there are people living in the top sukkah? We never said such a thing. And even if no one's living in the top sukkah, but still, the elyona is considered a sukkah, even if no one's living there, and should pass on the sukkah tachtona. Elalav, but rather we have to reinterpret Rabbi Yehuda. It's not that there's no one living in the top sukkah. Who cares? That's irrelevant. But no one could live in the top sukkah. My quote in ein diurim belyona, end of quote. Hainu, it means kol she'eina ru'uya l'dira. So far, it sounds very similar to Shmuel, that the reason why the bottom sukkah is psula is because the top sukkah is ru'uya l'dira. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says if the top, in event that the top sukkah is not ru'uya l'dira, it's not a sukkah, and the bottom sukkah is not sukkah skak. But the problem is, that's only Rabbi Yehuda's sheet. And the Chachamim never accepted that sheet. He says, "My ain't diurim, but belyona kol she'eina ru'uya l'dira. Hechi dami." What's a case of eina ru'uya l'dira? So here we're going to talk about two different cases. One is because it's very cramped; there's not that much airspace, and the other is because the karmic ksusos, as we said before, are very insecure. They can't hold them up. So first, let's go with the approach of a very uncomfortable sukkah, smaller than a dollhouse. The lo gavoa asar, that the top sukkah is not 10 tefachim high. And if that be the case, it's not a comfortable place which facilitates dira, and it's not a sukkah at all. So Rabbi Yehuda says that if there's no shame sukkah on the elyona because it's eina ru'uya l'dira, and it's less than 10 tefachim high, then it doesn't pass the sukkah tachtona. But whose sheet is that? Rabbi Yehuda. Michlal, I can deduce that the Tanakama, who passes in this case, Savar, he holds, Sha'af al pi shel yona eino ru'uya l'dira. Nevertheless, the tachtona is psula. Rabbi Yehuda was the one who was machadish that if the elyon is not ru'uya l'dira, the tachtona is kshera. Apparently, by implication, we derive that the Chacham would say the Elyona, even though it's Eina Ru'uya l'dira, would passel the Tachtona. And that's against Shmuel. Because we want to work out Shmuel in a way that he reconciles with the Tanakama. So now the Gemara is going to try a different approach to Rabbi Yehuda, which will have a different impact on our understanding of the Tanakama Rabbi Yehuda. Ella, Rav Dimi, he also, Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. He was one of the two main Amoraim who transmitted the Torah from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. It was Ravim and Rav Dimi. Omar, he said, Amri Pamar Rabba, this is what we knew, what we heard in Eretz Yisrael about Rabbi Yehuda when he said of Ein Dir and Bel Yonah. What did he have in mind? In Ein Hatachtona Yechol Lekabel Karm Ksusos Shel El Yonah. Hatachtona Kshera, but El Yonah Psula. What happens now? The schach of the Tachtona is the floor of the Elyona. And if he puts Karmuksusos on top of this schach, the schach of the Tachtona, then the Elyona is not royal Adira, because you can imagine the weight of a person on top of mattresses, which are on top of schach. And therefore, since the Elyona is defined as Ein Ruya Ladira because of the Karmuk Susos, therefore it doesn't generate a psul in the Tachtona. If, on the other hand, the Elyona was not 10 tfachim high, then even the Tanakama would say it's not called a sukkah at all, and it doesn't pass with sukkah Tachtona. That would support Shmuel, because the whole thrust of Shmuel was that unless the Sukkah Elyon is Kshera, it could not pass the Tachtona. So now the Gemara is assuming that when Rabbi Yehuda said that we could be Machshir the Tachtona, that was a case where the Elyona was Eda Royal Adira because of Karamuk Susams. And here's where the Tanakama disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and says that the top one is still considered a sukkah, and therefore the tachton is psula. But let's say a case which is such a dira srucha, it's so impossible to live there that the top sukkah is less than asar tefachim high, then even the chachamim, as Shmuel pointed out, would agree that it cannot pass the tachtona because the elyona is less than 10 tefachim high, and that's not called a sukkah at all. But not to be equated with the case of Ein HaSukkah Yechola Lekabel Karmuk Sosas. So the Gemara is not happy with this. It still finds the Shita of Shmuel very difficult. Rabbi Yehuda was Machshir the Tachtona in this case, where the schach of the Tachtona is not strong enough to hold up the weight of a person who's sleeping on mattresses on top of the schach. And that means that therefore the top sukkah is not a sukkah at all, because you can't sleep in such a sukkah. If you sleep in such a sukkah, I don't know what's going to happen to you. You'll fall through the schach on the bottom of, the gag of the tachtona. And now, if the schach of the tachtona cannot hold on to the karma psutzos for the elyona, then kekshera kach psula. You remember that principle? The elyona is not shera, so you don't say kekshera kach psula, that it can pass the bottom suk because the top one is kshera. Here it's not kshera. Now, if Rabbi Yehuda is applying that logic to the case of Eina Tachtona Machzik Karam Uksusos, then he should certainly apply that same logic to a sukkah that's less than Asar Tvachim high, which is a Dira Srucha. But if that be the case, then Michlal, we should be medayik the opposite as far as the Tanakama is concerned. The Tanakama is Sovra Achal Pi, even though the bottom sukkah and the schach of the bottom sukkah is not strong enough to hold up the karmic susos of the Elyona, nevertheless, the Elyona is considered a sukkah, and therefore the Tachton is psula. So it comes out that according to the Tanakama, even in a scenario where the sukkah Elyona is not ru'il adira, because you can't hold up the karmic susos on top of the schach of the tachtona, Therefore, you and I would have said, and that's Rabbi Yehuda's Shita, that it cannot passel the tachtona. Comes along with Tanakh and he says, no, it will passel the tachtona. You see clearly against Shmuel, because it means that you don't need that the Elyona be a sukkah kshera in order to passel the bottom sukkah. That's Rabbi Yehuda's Shita, but not the Tanakh. So now the Gemara makes an about face. And the Gemara is going to say, no, you made a mistake. The Tanakh does not reject Rabbi Yehuda. Even the Tanakh concedes that if the Tachtona cannot hold up the Karam Ksusas of the Elyona, then the Tachtona is Kshera, because the Elyona is not a Sukkah Kshera. And therefore the Tanakh agrees to Rabbi Yehuda and therefore to Shmuel that the only time that the schach of the Elyona would pass on the schach of the Tachtona is if the schach of the Elyona is Re'uya L'dira. So now you'll ask me, so what is the machlokas? Where is the battlefield between the Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda? Ika beinayu, the nafkan is going to be Yechol L'kabel Eidei Chach. What happens if the schach of the just one second. What it means is that when he puts, I'm trying to explain the word decha, when he puts the karamuk susos on top of the sukkah elyona, then the roof of the sukkah tachtona is going to begin to shake. And therefore, the status of the tachtona is very iffy. Tanakh holds that since bidocha, one second. Now, let me get the translation. This doesn't do it for me. So I'm sorry. Again, the Tanakh concedes that the Elyona will passel the Tachtona only if the Elyona, he says, can accommodate normal tenacity. Okay, I guess he means the weight of a person. So what is now the nafkamina between Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda? The lower sukkah can support the pillows of the cushions of the upper sukkah only with difficulty. So far, I think it's what we said. Rabbi Yehuda validates the lowest sukkah in such a case, while the Tanakh validates it. Let's see if he adds anything. It says both the Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda follow Shmuel's principle that the upper sukkah disqualifies the sukkah beneath it only if it itself is a full-fledged sukkah. Thus, the upper sukkah must be 10 tefachim tall. They disagree specifically in a case of the upper sukkah, which can support tenancy, I guess it means support, like tenacity, only with difficulty. Oh, tenancy means living, like a tenant. So he's talking about sleeping. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the upper sukkah does not acquire sufficient sukkah status. Why? Because you can't really live securely in the upper sukkah. Thus, the lower sukkah remains valid. Tanakh maintains that the upper sukkah passes as a sukkah, and therefore invalidates the lower sukkah. I mean, that's more or less what we said. The only thing that bothers me here is let me just read the Masechet one more time. He says, the ofen the Yechola Sukkah Tachona lekabel sakarim b'ksusos shel Sukkah Elyona, right? So you want to sleep on the mattresses of the Elyona, which are now located on top of the Sukkah Tachtona, but that could only work al yidei chak. And I guess he means because the bottom sukkah, the schach of the bottom sukkah is beginning to shake. That indicates that it really can't hold up the karm susis that are on top of it. So now the machlokis is defined. Tanakama savar shemei achar v'nitan lodur b'dochak v'sukel yona. Even though it's very shaky, but you could live, if need be, in the Elyona, meaning lying on the karmic susis that are on top of the tachtona, is there for yeshel sukkah, posel sukkah tachtona. If you decide me'achal lo nitan lodur b'sukkah Elyona b'revach, ain't oleh shem sukkah. The ain't poselos es tachtona. It sounds to me, I don't know, we have to research this further, that there's machlokas here about the status of the upper sukkah and whether you can be yotze the mitzvah in the upper sukkah. Im eini yachol lekabel afilu de chaka tachtona shera umashma basukkah shel yona psula. That's the way we learned it. All right, let's see the Mishnah, and we'll finish up very quickly. Now, the discussion here in this Mishnah is about schach posel, right? Schach has to be made of something that's not makabel tumah. And now he covers his sukkah with material, right? He wants to prevent the rains coming in or maybe the beating down of the sun, but the material that he's using to cover his schach is makabel tumah. That's called a sadin. So peres oleh sadin, mipnei achamo, o tachteo mipnei anachar. Now, in this case, underneath the sukkah, underneath the schach, he places a sadin because the schach has a lot of small pieces of twigs and leaves and whatnot that are falling into his sukkah. So he wants to protect his sukkah. And he separates the sukkah from the schach with a sadin in the middle. So it's either the sadin is on top of the schach or the sadin is under the schach. In both cases, the sukkah is psula. Why? Because the sadin is a davar makabel tumah, and he's being sochech with schach pos. Now, the Mishnah goes on to talk about another scenario in which the sukkah per se is kshera, but if you sit in a certain place in the sukkah, you're not yotze the mitzvah. And what's that case? Oh, meaning I didn't cover the entire, schach with sadin, with this sadin. Okay. So now we get into a discussion here about what's called noi sukkah. You could have many different things that are hanging from the sukkah, and if you're inside the sukkah, you are underneath those objects that separate you from the schach. And those objects are not schach. They're made of a davar makabel tumah. I mean, have you ever seen, like they put lanterns inside a sukkah, or maybe little
decorations people hang.
Right, decorates like mini jugs, and they put honey in the jug, or I don't know what.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all kalim and stuff that are on makabel tumah that's schach posel. So the answer to that is called nun. That which you put to protect the sukkah is called schach. And if it's a davar makabel tumah, it's schach posel. but that which you put in the sukkah for beauty purposes. And now the Mishnah is going to entertain the possibility that even a sadin, which is like a sheet, could possibly be l'shem nod. Maybe it's very beautiful and it's colorful, artistic. He says, "Oh, shepires al gabi hakinof." Kinof are 4 poles that are very tall, and they are tied down to the feet of his bed. So he's got the feet of his bed, and then he's got 4 poles coming out from each one of the feet of his bed that go vertically higher. Then he puts long reeds, kanim aruchim, nizeozer, li orech hamita, on top of the bed. Now, after he puts these kanim, he puts a sadin, which he covers over this little bed of his. But that sadin is not there to protect him from the sun because he already has, kinof. He has, he has sach kosher, which is made of kanim aruchim that cover and hover over his bed. So that when he spreads this sadin over his bed, he's doing so for the sake of nod. Psula. What does that mean, psula? This is a little bit confusing. Psula means that he's not going to fulfill his mitzvah of sukkah if he sleeps under this covering of a sadin, because now he's got what's called an oil, and that oil separates him from the schach. He's not sitting under the tzel of the schach, he's sitting under the tzel of the sadin. However, what is he allowed to do? Aval pores hu al gabi naklite amita. He can throw, if you will, a sadin over the 2 amudim that are mechubarim the emtza rochav hamita. This is what you call a canopy. I didn't see the English here, but I would call this a canopy bed. So what happens is now he's got 2 amudim, one at the head of the bed and one at the foot of the bed, and on top of these amudim he spreads a canopy which, like a teepee, in an upside down V shape, if you know what I mean, covers his bed. Now, in this case, the sadin is not called an oel, because an oel has to have a gag that's 1 tefach wide, and here it's 0 tefachim wide. It literally comes to like a triangle. So therefore, there's no oel. The sadin is not an oel, and it's not mafsik between the schach and the sleeper who's sleeping in the bed. When the Mishnah says that if he spreads a sadin over his sukkah on top of the schach, the sukkah is psula, that's because he's trying to protect the sukkah. For example, mipnei nesher, right? If it's underneath the schach because he wants to make sure he catches all of the pieces that might come in, or on top of the schach because he wants to protect it from the sun. So even though he made the schach from a davar hamakabel tumah, not the schach itself, but I mean the Masechet, which is this, this covering the sadin, which is for the purpose of a nesher, it's possible. But if he puts the sadin on top of his sukkah in order to beautify his sukkah, it has some sort of artistic beauty to it, then lina osa kshera. And the reason for that is because since he didn't put it there for the sake of schach, meaning to protect, but rather linoi, then it doesn't get a shame schach. And the sukkah is now kshera, even though the sadin is a davar makabel too. And the Gemara is so convinced of the logic it says pshita. I don't need Rav Chisda to invent the wheel, because the Mishnah says explicitly that he was pores the sadin, either on top or below, mipnei aneshet. So it's clear from our Mishnah that if he did not put the sadin mipnei aneshet, but rather he put it there l'shem noi, it would not pass the sukkah. And the Gemara answers, Ma'odetema, I would have thought, even if he puts the sadin for the purpose of beauty, it would also be a sukkah psula of a haidiktani mipnei anesher. And why did the Mishnah add mipnei anesher? Which seems to imply that the only reason is possible because it was there for schach. In most cases, when a person puts a sadin on top of his schach, he does it to protect it from nesher, not because of noi. Kamash Malan, that's what Rav Chisda wants to teach me, that that's not so. Rather, the Tana, when he mentions mipnei nesher, he means b'dafka mipnei nesher, and that's why the sukkah is psula. But if he puts it there in a osa, then it is ksheira. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop.
Okay, shkoyach, very good.
And I wish you a good week. This is a famous sugya of Sukkah Tachas HaSukkah.
Yeah. Very,
Okay.
yes, excellent.
Excellent. All right, call two.
Okay.